I tightened the noose around her neck. That line wasn't found in a confession. It was found in a novelist's debut, 3 years after a real victim died in the same way. Prosecutors would argue the book wasn't just fiction, it was a map back to the crime. The winter of 2000 settled over Roswell like a locked room. Bright river by day, long industrial shadows by night, and a case that would sink to the bottom before anyone knew it existed. On December 10th, fishermen near the Oder's tributaries spotted a body, male, bound, starved, strangled, floating after weeks unseen. Later identified as 35-year-old small business owner Dariusz Janaszewski, who had vanished on November 13th after leaving his office to meet a potential client who never officially existed. The autopsy documented the ligatures, the restraint, the slow, deliberate fashion of his death, enough to suggest planning, but not enough to name who planned it. And the case turned cold within months as winter became routine again. Enter Detective Jacek Wróblewski, a methodical investigator who took the file in 2003 the way a chess player opens the middle game. Patient, forensic, allergic to coincidence. He retraced steps others considered dead ends, phone records, old leads, rumors, gray smoke, until something stubborn appeared in the data. A call routed through a prepaid mobile tied to an online sale that looped back to a former philosophy student and budding author named Krystian Bala. The phone used to reach Janaszewski's office had been purchased and later sold on eBay by Bala. The same Bala whose personal life had recently entangled with rumors about his wife meeting another man. The sort of rumor that breeds motive in the dark. But the strangest thread wasn't in police archives, it was on a bookstore shelf. In 2003, 3 years after Janaszewski's death, Bala self-published a novel called Amok, a feverish, provocative book whose narrator seems to hover near a murder carried out with chilling specificity, including a strangulation and binding that matched the unreleased details of the Janaszewski case with unnerving proximity. A critic might have called it transgressive fiction. A detective called it a breadcrumb trail. Wróblewski read, underlined, cross-referenced, and then asked the question that would frame the next 2 years. What kind of writer puts the method of a murder in print unless he believes no one will ever connect the dots back to him? It wouldn't be the first time literature brushed against real blood, but rarely had a new novelist seemed to know intimate, non-public details of a homicide, down to the noose's grip and the stage absence of the perpetrator's clean hands. Bala, meanwhile, nurtured his public persona, photographer, traveler, edgy thinker, someone who wrote about embracing dangerous impulses as if detachment were a moral alibi. In the space between the man and the manuscript, investigators sensed a second crime scene, the page. Detective Wróblewski's team mapped the overlaps. Dates in the book versus dates in the file, topography of the river versus the novel's geography, and the narrator's fixation on control, on withholding food, on ritualized restraint, mirroring the forensic record's grim timeline of starvation and strangulation before the body surfaced on December 10th, 2000. The kicker was provenance. Who knew those details between November and December of 2000, and who would dare publish something so close 3 years later unless the publishing itself was part taunt, part purge? The first tension peak arrived with the phone trail. The call that lured Janaszewski out originated from a mobile later sold online by Bala, a fact established through transaction history and corroborated links. A circumstantial chain, yes, but one that put Bala within the gravitational field of the last communication the victim received alive on November 13th, 2000. Prosecutors would later explain that the book couldn't be admitted as a confession. Fiction is not a deposition, but it could raise questions, generating new leads that would be tested in the real world. Bank statements, travel, acquaintances with grudges and alibis that sounded performative under pressure. It wasn't that Amok proved a murder, it suggested where to look. Pause and reflect. How many of us believe our masks are perfect until we write in our own voice and give the mask a mouth? Literature is a safe room until it isn't. Investigators learned Bala had hired a private detective years earlier to surveil his wife, and they believed jealousy was motive. Less a flash of rage, more a careful humiliation he wanted to reverse by asserting absolute control, a theme echoed in passages of a mock that prosecutors would describe as parallel rather than proof, a mirrored corridor that nonetheless led back to the same door. A second tension peak came when a specific phrasing in commentary around the case, "I tightened the noose around her neck," was tied to how a detective perceived the novel's killer speaking, close enough in method to force hard questions about authorial distance and insider detail that had not been widely publicized in 2000 to 2003. Forensic timing, bindings, and the river disposal technique formed a triad that felt less like coincidence and more like an unguarded reflection. Wróblewski pushed for warrants, and in 2007, after years of cross-checking physical and digital traces, Polish authorities arrested Bala, setting the stage for a trial where the novel would be mentioned not as evidence of guilt per se, but as a catalyst, a pattern that led to tangible evidence jurors could weigh. Records, timelines, and motive. Media coverage spiked. Readers bought Amok to play detective, turning bookstores into annexes of the courtroom as people hunted for clues on the printed page that prosecutors claimed lived in the real world first. The spectacle created a feedback loop. The more the public read, the more the idea hardened that a killer had confessed in art because he couldn't bear the anonymity of silence. By late 2007, a Polish court convicted Bala of planning and committing the murder and sentenced him to 25 years, emphasizing the totality of evidence rather than the book alone, while acknowledging the uncanny overlap between narrative and fact. The appellate court ordered a retrial in 2007, procedural prudence in a case warped by attention. And in December 2008, a new court again found Bala guilty, affirming the sentence and the core logic of the investigation. Fiction opened a door, evidence walked through it. Beyond Poland, the case joined a strange canon, the writer whose pages spill into police files, alongside examples like Chinese novelist Liu Yongbiao, who, after being arrested in 2017 for a 1995 quadruple homicide, said some of his works drew on his thoughts about those murders and had even drafted a title for a future book, The Beautiful Writer Who Killed, before his 2018 death sentence, a macabre echo of life imitating art, imitating life. Together, these cases raised a legal question that courts keep revisiting. When does a novel become relevant in a courtroom? And how do judges separate imagination from admission without chilling speech? In Roswell, the river kept moving, indifferent, and the book kept selling. The victim's family, whose grief was private before it became public, attended hearings where pages were discussed as if they were fingerprints, a surreal inversion of how stories are supposed to work. The detective who followed a sentence back to a suspect would later be cited in international coverage as the man who read a mystery novel like a case file and found both the author and the ending. The twist, if there is one, is not that art exposed a killer, but that a killer mistook art for absolution, believing that changing names, blurring settings, and rephrasing methods would anonymize the act, when in truth those choices preserved the signature more clearly than silence ever would. In court, the novel didn't testify. The records did. Phone lineage from buyer to seller, the timing of calls, the behavioral pattern consistent with luring Januszewski out on November 13th, and the forensic schema of restraints and strangulation, while the book's proximity lent an unsettling chorus to the evidence's melody. Jurors heard that jealousy, traced through prior surveillance of Bala's wife, was not a rumor but a motive with paperwork and witnesses, something that explained why the victim, merely connected by a social thread, became the canvas for control. The immediate aftermath was paradoxical. Bala gained notoriety as a mock sold to curious readers, yet the conviction in 2007, affirmed after the 2008 retrial, fixed his status not as outlaw artist, but as prisoner number, a person whose next novel, tentatively titled Deliric, was rumored in police reports to be braided with plans for another killing, according to evidence found on his computer, a claim that turned the earlier debate about fiction's borders into a flashing red line for public safety. Detectives do not want to be literary critics. They want to test hypotheses against facts. Here, the hypothesis born on the page guided them to traceable systems. E-commerce receipts, cellular metadata, travel proof, and social vectors of jealousy. And then the quieter reveal, a culture's fascination with the idea that evil can't help but show off, that narcissism writes its own wanted poster, that the better story will always out, but only if someone is stubborn enough to read it without flinching. Wróblewski's decision to read Amok like evidence was not a leap of faith. It was a disciplined bet that the author had left himself no room to be ordinary. The river gave the body back. The bookstore gave the method a voice. In a broader landscape, the Bala saga aligns with cases where writers' lives collided with violence. Anne Perry, famed historical mystery author, whose role in a 1954 murder as a teenager became widely known decades later, reshaping how readers interpreted her work and how the industry grappled with talent and accountability in the same human being. A reminder that public narratives are often palimpsests of darker drafts underneath. And in China, Liu Yongbiao's conviction for a 1995 quadruple killing, paired with his statement that his writing had been influenced by what he'd done, and his planned title, The Beautiful Writer Who Killed, added an eerie symmetry to Bala's story. Fiction not merely inspired by crime, but orbiting it so closely that arrest felt like literary criticism written as a warrant. The last pages of this story are not triumphant. They are careful. A man is dead. A family carries the date, November 13th, like a weight. And a country remembers that sometimes the line between a plot device and a person's last minutes is thinner than a page. Long-term, Bala's conviction and 25-year sentence stand as a benchmark for how courts can treat fiction. Not as evidence by itself, but as a guidepost that can validate investigative avenues leading to admissible proof, a template later echoed in debates about admitting creative work when its specific overlaps are probative rather than prejudicial. Internationally, the Liu Yongbiao case reinforced that authorship can be a double life, and revelations about Anne Perry's past highlighted how society renegotiates an artist's legacy when history intrudes, complicating how publishers, readers, and victims' families coexist with the work left behind. The moral question is unsettling. When an author's story echoes a victim's last moments, is reading an act of understanding or complicity? And should art that maps a real crime ever be allowed to hide the author's tracks?
Don't forget to subscribe to Real Mystery Reports for more strange, dark, and profoundly human stories. New true mysteries every day.